So
but Ken, these all look like Pantone 1 gray and Pantone 2 grayer, but they
it's all 10YR, isn't it? That's the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reineck and Ken Holyoke.
Welcome back to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reineck, joining you this time from Southern New England and being joined by, as always, Ken Holyoke in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
Oh, not too bad. Coming to you live from Studio 589.
Fantastic. And those of you that can't see this, Studio 589 is Ken's fashionably appointed rooms in Lethbridge. And the other thing you can't see is that Ken's eyes are heavy with the weight of somebody who got a job before their dissertation was finished and now really needs to finish that dissertation. And so the fatigue, he's you can't see this, but he's actually vaping, and I've never seen a man vape out of what appears to be a water pipe the size. Oh, it's his microphone. I see what it is. I see. I don't know where the smoke is from. But so Ken is doing well, as you just heard. And he's doing so well that he asked if he could give this week's prize read. We're going to be talking about the Late Maritime Archaic, and he has we have an appropriate prize for you. If you are the person that come up with the new name for the podcast here, the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. And so where would a listener write in if they had a new name, Ken?
They're going to be writing into newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. The rarest available Gmail address. And unfortunately, this week we don't have listener mail to read, but we have had a few suggestions. We've even had a couple suggestions on Facebook that we broaden the scope of the title of the podcast.
Oh, interesting.
Beyond just archaeology.
Oh, beyond archaeology, not beyond New Brunswick.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think maybe also beyond New Brunswick, but that we cover a broad range of topics that extend beyond just the archaeology of New Brunswick, that we talk about history more generally, which is...
I was going to do that thing that there's really no one more annoying than an American who's immigrated to Canada about this stuff, because they immediately immigrate and it's the zealousness of the convert, right? And they immediately become complete cultural nationalists. And so I was at an ESAF meeting once, and I won't name the fellow, but he's an immigrant. He'd probably never admit this to you. It's from, it's not a state as bad as Ohio, but like a similar state to Ohio down in the United States. And I had a poppy in my jacket, and he ran up to me and he said, "Oh, another Canadian." And I said, "No, you know full well I'm an immigrant, and I know full well you are too."
You're both wearing your Summit Series jerseys.
Yeah, exactly. The Maple Leaf tattoo, a temporary tattoo, really gave it away.
Yeah.
But okay, so we've had suggestions that we'd extend it to include history.
Yeah. That we're covering a broad scope, and that we should acknowledge that. So that's definitely in the it's in the fishbowl of suggestions.
Fantastic. But so if we were to reach into the fishbowl and find our winner, find something that just really had to be the new name of this podcast, and that was this week, what exciting prize would that person win, Ken?
Well, one of the themes that we're going to be talking about this week is long distance exchange. And we thought that it would be appropriate to send the listener a mundane item from a great distance. And you may be surprised by how mundane that item is, and how much that item, having gone such a long distance, ends up having such an importance to you. And along with that item that may arrive by your favorite courier, Canada Post, and if it's Canada Post, it may never get there. But along with that, we're also going to arrange to have Skip the Dishes delivered to you a sizable, maybe 2-person meal size steak of swordfish, frozen, of course, so that you can cook it however you'd like. But you'll have a lovely meal and a long distance item, and you can really maybe grill your swordfish and sit down and listen to this podcast and just think about the cynicisms going on between your meal your audio experience.
So the listener may have just thought they heard an aspirated yes from my side, but it's the fact that I'm just drooling from the excitement of this grilled swordfish steak, which sounds incredibly delicious. Ken, how do you prepare swordfish usually when you make it?
I'll admit I've never cooked swordfish myself. I've eaten
Oh,
it,
interesting.
but I would imagine that'd be one you'd want to sear, like get it really hot, a little bit of oil, salt and pepper, and just sear it. And you'd probably just do salt and pepper. I don't think you'd need much more than that.
That's exactly how I've done it. And but speaking
And
of
I eat it
aspirated,
with Rostra chopsticks.
Rostra, oddly Noah Bubs. And but speaking of aspirated yeses, and our sponsor, every one of those aspirated yeses is sponsored by the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick. And ordinarily, I would direct you to apanb.ca, but as a member of the board, I'm told that we may actually not have paid our fee to our internet provider this month. I assume it's monthly, not fortnightly, like this podcast. But we are in the process of settling up, and we will soon have apanb.ca back online, and we encourage you to check it out.
Yeah, but GoDaddy has demanded cash.
This is a family podcast, Ken. I have to remind you again. Our other exciting news, though, in a land that is adjacent, perhaps, to sponsorships, is that we have our very first swag has arrived. And these, the listener who knows Ken as well as I know Ken, well, there are no listeners listening who know Ken, except maybe his parents who know Ken as well as I know Ken, will think that we probably got lapel pins, but it's tax season and we haven't gotten our returns yet, and lapel pins are expensive. So instead what we did was Ken has just received an order of 200 stickers. Those of you who are following on our Instagram will know exactly what these stickers look like. They're a fetching representation of our logo. They're suitable for putting on whatever high-end insulated travel mug you use. If you're a Hydro Flask user, a Yeti user, a Stanley mug user, whatever it is you use to get yourself to work in the morning or to get yourself to bed in the evening, that is the mug that will hold this sticker. And we're pretty pleased with them. And I think so that the way to do this, the way to get one, I believe, is it's actually sort of an encounter method that if you see Ken at the SAAs, you can request one if you're one of the first 150 people, Ken, is that right?
I think that's the idea, yep.
Yeah, and then I'm going to at some point have a stash of 50 or so of these, which if there's enough uptake, we will replenish. There's probably other ways to get these. Knowing us probably helps. You know, if you're the sort of person who's got political capital, if you're the sort of person we owe money to.
If you're the sort of person that we think would scan the QR code and listen to our podcast.
That would be a great candidate for this.
And for the listener and for the lucky recipients of these this first edition swag, that's the other thing, is that this will be the first edition. We'll try to find some way to make it known so that in the second edition, you can point out that, well, I had the first wave of these. I'm an early adopter. Once our names are in the stars. The listener,
what are we gonna do? We're gonna like obliterate York County. We'll just like there will be no York County. It'll just it won't be visible on them.
Well, it's funny you bring up counties. So on the new logo, on the revised logo, we've centered in on New Brunswick, and we've colorized each of the counties, each of the many counties of New Brunswick, and in doing so, what the viewer and listener will find on these lovely stickers is that we have used New Brunswick's official colors. And these are featuring Pantone 116 yellow, Pantone 186 red, and Pantone 286 blue, official colors from the New Brunswick government website. So
Ken, these all look like Pantone 1 gray and Pantone 2 grayer, but they
it's all 10YR, isn't it?
That's yeah, exactly. Yeah. Get over to the glaze page and you're good. So we're very excited about that. We'd also like to thank a number of people. So people haven't been writing into our email address as much, but that's okay. But we'd like to give a shout out to folks who've left reviews on our podcast. We've gotten a number of 5-star reviews, which we really appreciate. So thank you very much. And we certainly enjoy the reviews and comments that you leave for us there on whatever server you use. And we'd also like a special shout out to the folks in the archaeology lab at St. Mary's University and the folks doing cultural resource management archaeology in Vermont, both of whom have written in, and we appreciate your comments. So thank you very much.
Yep.
And so take this as a warning, dear listener, that if you don't want horribly revealing information that's going to make it almost incredibly easy to identify you, even without us saying your name, you should mention this, and we'll turn on this. We'll say, you're calling in from North Dakota or wherever. We could do that thing that I used to listen late at night, Ken. I think I've mentioned this to you. This really terrible talk radio show called Coast to Coast AM, and the great thing, it was all essentially conspiracy theories or ghosts and this kind of thing. And the great thing was that the calls weren't screened, so people would call in and it went right to the host. And he would always have the only options were west of the Rockies, you're on the air, or east of the Rockies, you're on the air, or wild card line. And or get faxes. We should get a fax machine, probably.
I think there's still one in Annex C, isn't there? Or in the Incutech lab?
No, we've gone all no fax.
Oh,
yeah. The Moho wire has been canceled.
Oh.
But I guess, Ken, the real reason that people have tuned in is because they know that we are committed to keeping these shows to a lean 45 minutes. And now that
cool
we've
45.
Exactly. And now that we've ragged the puck, are you listening to that phrase, immigration officer? We should get going on our conversation day, which is the Late Maritime Archaic, which is about 5,500 years ago to 3,500 years ago. And as always, those are calibrated years. Those are real calendar years. And it's a conversation we're sort of excited to have, because if you're involved in Northeast archaeology, this is one of the kind of iconic periods, and it's one of the really interesting periods, although all the periods are really interesting, but it's one of the ones that I think occupies the public imagination in a much bigger way, and also one of the ones that's been somewhat controversial in not just professional conversation, although certainly there, but also in public understanding of the region. But so to set the stage for this, though, we want to do some housekeeping that's basically some anthropological background that's going to make the rest of our conversation make more sense. And so we want to talk about this thing that anthropologists use, this term that anthropologists use, and that is complexity. And so, Ken, what is complexity?
So when I'm teaching this, I have kind of a list, and there's sort of a ticky box when it comes to the anthropological definition of complexity. So there's groups who will rely on surplus production. So they make more food than they can consume sort of in one setting. So they maybe store food. There's a dependence on storage. You see specialization. So whether that's in making very elaborate tools or particular types of crafts. So craft production or tool production. So there's groups within, there's members of the society that are sort of tasked with making nice things. You start to see status differentiation. So that means they're members of society that actually have a different social ranking maybe than others. And we tell this in anthropology and in archaeology, we sort of make these determinations usually based on grave goods and the way people are buried, the way people are treated in cemeteries is usually a reflection of how they were viewed by society during their life in some ways, right? And so burials with more elaborate grave goods, for example. So if somebody's buried with, stone from a great distance, then that may give you an indication that this person maybe had a role that was a little bit more separate from everybody else in society. So there may be social inequality or hierarchy. You get this widespread or exchange of exotic goods or wealth goods. So things from a great distance, usually fairly elaborate tools. like the listener will experience.
I was gonna say, does it come with a frozen swordfish steak, or is that
well,
exclusive to the pod?
as we'll talk about this, in some cases it may have. Actually, not even, probably like swordfish sushi. Really, that's
swordfish tartare.
Tartare. Territoriality. So this is mine, that is yours. So kind of establishing that particular spaces in the landscape are for certain groups and for certain people, not necessarily, and to trespass across that may come with some kind of like interpersonal conflict. You may see fortification, so some sort of defensive structure or evidence of increased conflict. Generally, and this is your jam, bigger houses come with a complexity, and most groups in general probably have a larger population, that sort of thing. So you have an increasing population. That's sort of like a ticky box list, but really what we're talking about are, sort of that groups have gone beyond what we talked about the last few weeks, sort of this classic forager model where you're highly mobile, you are generally subsisting off of like available resources and that sort of thing. You're maybe settling down a little bit, staying in one place for a longer period of time, and doing some and more complicated things with the way you've organized your life.
So sort of we might sort of say, like, politically, you've got the stereotypical sort of imaginary AMP 1000 band, right? And that band has got basically no real political offices. It'll have like a headman who's pretty much achieved all of his status, and his actual power in society is extremely minimal, kind of pro forma.
Yeah.
And then the other hand,
you can always sort of walk away from those sorts of social and political organizations.
Exactly. Yeah. And then at the other hand, you might have a group sort of like the Zulu, right, where you've got complicated political structures that are inherited, that are overlapping. You've got checks and balances. You've got all these kinds of things, right? And so in reality, probably most societies fall, in between something like Canada and the Kungsan, something that's sort of in between is the vast majority of groups. And we think about, though, hunter-gatherers as being the kind of classic, you might say, simple, and there's kind of quotes around that, right? Because we're just talking about their political organization, society. And there's been a kind of raging debate in the literature lately about whether or not the term hunter-gatherer even means much of anything, right? And part of the reason for this is that we keep finding out that hunter-gatherers keep doing all sorts of political stuff that in your sort of undergraduate class you don't hear about, right? So when you learn about hunter-gatherers and you're an undergraduate, you imagine the kind of this sort of the opposite of what Ken was describing when he described complexity. They're very egalitarian, very little political organization, very little territoriality, very little, they're not making monuments, they're not making cemeteries, they're not staying in one place for a long time. And it turns out that there are all sorts of examples of hunter-gatherers doing things other than this. And it used to be that you take this class and it would be as if there were one group that did this, and that was the Northwest Coast hunter-gatherers. And you mentioned, Ken, that Gary Copeland had a definition for, was it complex hunter-gatherers?
Yeah, they don't live in small groups and they don't move around a lot.
Right. Yeah. So they're basically, year-round residents, big population. And they also make big houses, right? Gary yep. Co-authored that, or co-edited that book. I think it's just called People Who Live in Big Houses.
Yeah, it's called People at Gary and Ted Banning, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Which is sort of about complex hunter-gatherers who live in big houses, big multifamily houses.
All over the world.
Yeah, exactly. And who live fairly permanently in them. And, who've, in the kind of classic example from the Northwest Coast, right, is that these people had slaves, right? You can't get much more politically complex than that, Yeah. So we've got huge amounts of status differentiation. But then it turns out that in the Archaic period, which we're still talking about, there are also other examples of this, right? So you've got this classic kind of broad spectrum revolution, but even in places where people aren't settling down, right, in this quite the same way, like in the Northwest Coast, the idea was the salmon runs were so productive, the clam beds are so productive that you just kind of settle down. Why would you not be complex? Why would you start farming? That would be a lot worse than this gig you've got going. And so instead, but then you get places like Poverty Point, right, where you get monuments, you get big populations, you get that's in the southeast United
Southeast.
States.
Yep.
Um,
Louisiana, isn't it?
yeah, I think it is. And and you get similar things along the St. John River in Florida that Ken Sassman's worked on.
Yeah.
And
these people are like, these are hunter-gatherers building these really complicated earthworks. Really interesting. Like Sassman goes into this interesting stuff where they've done, I can't remember the other guy's name, that came up with it. Basically all of these middle and late archaic monumental structures in the Southeast were following a standardized like dimension, the standard metric, basic unit or something like that, or and
it's like somewhere running around the Southeast was like the archaic period indigenous palladio, right? Like telling you, the perfect dimensions for your countertops and your houses and your but your shell heaps in particular.
Shell heaps, and then in earthen mounds at some point. So
and so the reason this is also relevant, though, is that when we're talking about the Maritime Archaic, this is really kind of New Brunswick, the far northeast. It's their version of this problem, which is what does hunter-gatherer really mean if we've got all these signs of complexity? And so, as we mentioned at the top, we're talking about this period 5,500 to 3,500 years ago, and what we're going to be talking about are really the iconic, what are sometimes called in the popular literature, the red paint people. And we should say at the outset, we're going to be talking about basically cemeteries, which were excavated. We wouldn't excavate these kinds of sites now, but there's going to be a discussion of cemeteries. And so just to kind of flag that at the beginning. And basically sort of the origins of our modern understanding of this period are from Newfoundland. And so this is from Elmer Harp in the 50s, Jim Tuck in the 60s, and it's at the Port au Choix site, which is on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, where kind of inadvertently there'd been some excavation going on for a building, I think a billiards parlor or something.
Yeah, it was renovating a hotel or something like that, wasn't it?
Something like that. Yeah. I get confused because I think it was a billiards parlor run by a guy named Billiards. It's something like this, and I just get completely confused by this, and I always second guess myself on this. And so, listener, don't check the show notes because I'm not going to be able to figure this out before we go to press. And so Elmer Harp out of Dartmouth, Jim Tuck out of Newfoundland, then kind of worked on this question. And one of the things about this cemetery is if you're in Newfoundland, right, it's supposed to be kind of classic. That's hunter-gatherer country, unless you're at Lonesome Meadow. But what came out were these, burials with red ochre, which is a red-colored hematite. Yep, exactly.
So an iron oxide powder. So if you're trying to think of what the color is, think about like basically a much brighter rusty color, basically, but a much more red than rust would look like. But it's the same oxidized iron, basically.
I believe it's the color that our names appear in on our new stickers, is it not?
Oh. I'm going to trust you on that one.
And in addition to this basically cemetery that appeared, there were gouges, which we've talked about in past episodes, groundstone artifacts, kind of hollowed out in the middle, slate knives, bone daggers, flakestone points, and there were like 100 graves here. It was included with animal remains, beads, slate stone tools, whale effigies, the sorts of things that we would associate with complexity, right? If you were to sort of list this trait list to an anthropologist, they'd say, yeah, that's complexity. That's not kind of classically understood hunter-gatherer cemeteries.
And if I'm not wrong here, much of this stuff had not been heavily used. Like a lot of this stuff was essentially made to be included in these graves, right? Like that's another thing, is that when you see these graves, these very elaborate graves, many of the items that go with these people are more probably talismans or things that they kept with them and weren't used even in a hunt, maybe. Like sometimes they may have been used, but many of these objects look like they were made exclusively to be placed with this individual, or they were things that maybe the individual carried with them over time and that were buried with them, as opposed to being used like in a functional way.
Yeah, exactly. And so and some of them are even kind of so fragile that you can't really imagine them having a functional use. You know, we get these, we're going to talk about this more, but what archaeologists in this region call bayonets, these kind of long slate things that are so kind of fragile, you can't really imagine that they would have a practical use. And the take-home point, you know, maybe from all this was that it's this highly visible archaeological phenomenon. But the other point is really, this sure doesn't seem like what the archaic was supposed to be, right? This is not the archaic stage we understand.
Especially in this region.
Well, exactly, right? Where we talked about last, it was going to get confusing because we got a special episode inserted there, but in the last, a fortnight
in the middle
ago,
archaic, early archaic, I guess we called it,
Yeah, the middle archaic was Bill Farley. He just appeared. But this is what happens. You reminisce about Bill Farley, and he's such a vortex of energy. You immediately forget what you were saying. And here I am, you know, playing a land game with Ken, and we're about to go on a raid. But it's not an inside joke for the listener because they heard the last episode, so it's okay. We're still going to bring in audience on this one. But we talked about this idea that the archaic was so low visibility for the first 5,000 years or so that people didn't know it was really here until like the 80s. So this idea that we're really kind of starting to in Newfoundland, we've got this complicated phenomenon going on. There's a documentary made about this. I think you've seen it, Ken. Is it it's by Timmerick?
Is this the red paint people one, like the main what's it called? Not PBS. Nova? Is this the Nova?
Yeah, it's a Nova. It's a Nova episode. Yeah.
Yeah. It's actually on YouTube, I think, now, isn't it?
It is now. Yeah. Dave and I watched it on an old VHS at his place once, and it's super interesting. But it'll
be linked in the show notes.
It will be linked in the show notes. Unless Ken passes out and I peace out to Death Valley before that happens, which is not a metaphor, listener. I am actually going to Death Valley next week, so I'll be literally live from the high Nevada desert.
And I'll be walking through the shadow of the Valley of Death.
He looks well, listener. Don't worry about it. Don't. He's doing great. Not to bring Bill Farley back again, but as he told me about my dissertation, D is for done. So,
yep. That's the territory I'm in right now.
Yeah. And but you've got this sort of highly visible phenomenon, and in this late archaic period in Newfoundland, you've got these really pretty visible, and in the 50s and 60s when Harp and Tucker are working on these pretty idiosyncratic phenomena. Okay, so this is in the north, right? And now let's bring the listener back down to a much earlier work in the south. And we've mentioned Warren King Moorhead before, who's sometimes called the Dean of American Archaeology, affiliated with the Robert S. Peabody Institute out of Andover, Massachusetts, ran around mostly Maine, a little bit in New Brunswick, with his gigantic trowel and his team of excavators called the Force, pretty much targeting indigenous burials, right? We wouldn't do this now. And really, really targeting these, quote, red paint burials.
And why was it that he was able to find them so easily?
Well, was it because he basically developed an early predictive model that meant he was testing interesting riverine locations?
Exactly. And that these cemeteries appear to be placed in sort of significant places in the landscape.
So you're into places, Ken. You use this placemaking phrase with a hyphen sometimes.
Yeah.
Tell us about that a little bit.
Basically, it means that, so when we talk about placemaking, we're talking about people living in particular natural settings, right? And the sort of the argument is that a natural space becomes a cultural place through sort of repeated actions and connections and sort of, you may come into a place and you camp there because there's a fish run, but then you live there for a season and you come back, and then you invite friends to come with you, and it becomes more and more important over time, and you build up not just sort of a cultural like material culture in that area. You build up sort of a memory and a sort of social importance of that place, and over time, what was at one time a natural setting sort of becomes this cultural place that is imbued. Sort of, you identify yourself as much with the place as you do sort of with each other. And so we are from here. This is where we're from. This is the kinds of things we do in this place. And so it becomes a really important cultural thing, and it becomes a social thing, and it's bound up in identity and memory, and that is passed on sort of and reproduced through all the things that you do at these places, basically. So what is the sort of go-to line? Made and is made by. We have another way of saying that we would have to put an explicit tag on here. But
I think the line is made and is made by, emplaced and is emplaced by, or something like that.
Yeah. So placemaking is the act of making place, like making a cultural place. So essentially, these places in the landscape, whether you call them persistent places or you call it, acts of placemaking, it's basically that stuff happens at locations that people do that become sort of structuring elements of their society in some ways, right? Like you guys have a great example from Port Jolly, where a sweat house was made with a sort of core axial feature that we'll probably talk about here in a few weeks. That it seems like all the houses were built sort of on this structure, and so there was a way to arrange the way that you lived inside the house, and that was based around making that place in the landscape first, kind of.
Yeah, so you get these, and I think this is sort of unsurprising to those of us who are humans, right? Our listeners who are not chatbots. Yeah. And there's some interesting stuff on this, and we'll return to this too. But what you were just saying reminded me of. So I just made kind of the I think we all have connections to places, right? We see places, we're struck by them, we recognize that places shape us. But there's also just really interesting stuff about this in the Northeast, right? So Micah Pauling wrote this really interesting paper about Wabanaki perceptions of home in the last 5 years, maybe. And he talks about Henry David Thoreau, who is in Western Maine with his Wabanaki guide, Joe Paulus. And he's going to drop Joe Paulus off at basically near the Kineo, the source for Kineo Rhyolite, and they're on the boat. And Thoreau really admired Paulus. He was one of his 3 most admired people, and according to his journals. And Thoreau said, "You must be happy. We're going to drop you off, and you're going to go home," which was to a place called Indian Island near Orono, Maine. And Paulus said, "Doesn't make much difference to me. Home's kind of anywhere," or something like that. And it's sort of implying that it's this idea that the whole territory was kind of home, and
like Chilton talks about homeland as a concept, right? That there are like places within the landscape that become that aren't just specific locations, that's whole territories. Like Moore and Thompson talk about this, like in the Green River in the late Archaic as well, that like sort of people were brought into these landscapes in the southeast of the United States, kind of attracted by the shell that was there first. But then these whole river valleys basically became like sort of identity, right? Like, the people that lived within the valley themselves were identified with each other, and that like there were other people around them, that, this notion of territoriality is sort of built on this notion of place as well, too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so I'm sensing that Ken and I, committed to someday finishing an episode in under an hour and 30 minutes, should stop riffing on this idea. But what I want the listener to put a pin in this, though, is that the idea that they should recognize, which is that people can have expansive ideas of place, which I'm going to return to make an argument, places that they're connected to, which I'm going to return to make an argument later in the show. So, feel free to rewind. I know many of you are actively taping this show. you can put this back in your tape machine, run it backwards.
I believe it's called scrubbing, isn't it? In the streaming age.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Like when you slide the little timer thingy back and forth.
Oh, is that called scrubbing?
I think so.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
We'll confirm this. This may be a Hakuna Errata.
This could be week. This could be Hakuna Errata. That will be next week, next fortnight. Next week, I'm going to be in the desert.
Yeah. Our next episode will actually come from Portland, won't it?
Are you going to be in Portland?
Oh yeah, 2 weeks I am in Portland.
Okay, so that actually means, listener, that next week or next fortnight. What is time? What is time? Next fortnight, the listener will be getting what is a special episode during our regularly scheduled Susquehanna episode, but we'll push that back. Yeah. So it's going to be, there'll probably be a listener there with you at the bar, making a suit out of our new stickers.
Could be.
That would be great.
Yeah.
But okay. But so we've talked about expansive ideas of place. And so now let's just kind of reel in back. So we were to catch you up in case you've lost where Ken and I were as we wandered away. We've just talked about Port au Choix, where there were all sorts of interesting, where there's basically an interesting cemetery with all sorts of elaboration. There's another term that anthropologists, archaeologists use that we wouldn't ordinarily associate with hunter-gatherers. Sure doesn't seem like what we think the Archaic's supposed to be. And so then it kind of turns up to this fellow Moorhead in basically around the turn of the century. And by the turn of the century, I mean around 1900, is running around chasing out red paint people. These burials that they often actually don't have many human remains in them, if any human remains, but they are features, they're immovable artifacts with red ochre included in them, and really diagnostic artifacts, which include shark teeth, plummets, gouges, celts, contracting stem points, and then notably they include bayonets of various shapes. These artifacts and these forms of burial that Moorhead is finding have an awful lot in common. They really resemble the kinds of materials that Port au Choix exhibited. So what this suggested to Jim Tuck was that there was this massive shared cultural phenomenon in the late Archaic period that basically went from Maine all the way up to the kind of northern areas in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so what Tuck kind of suggested in many ways presaged some of what we were thinking about in terms of the problems with how we understand what a hunter-gatherer is. That there are all sorts of things hunter-gatherers do, even if they're not these kind of classic Northwest Coast examples that are basically complex, right? So we've got hunter-gatherers acting in ways that hunter-gatherers don't often act. Does that kind of match with your sense of the baseline here, Ken?
Yeah, and they're sharing like a tradition, like a way of burying the dead over, thousands of, like hundreds to thousands of kilometers, right? And these are not people that are seeing each other every day, but there's a communication that this is how we do this, that's being that's carrying over a huge area.
And again, I think this is the sort of idea about identity that is not particularly surprising to the kind of contemporary listener, right?
Yeah.
That this is how we sort of expect humans to act, I think. And there's a really classic example of this phenomenon that occurs in New Brunswick, and that's the Cow Point Cemetery. And so this is excavated by David Sanger, and it, I think, is would you say that so I've actually never quite been sure, is Cow Point the defining example of the Moorhead phase, which is what we use to describe this southern kind of variant of the late maritime archaic.
I would say so, yeah, at least from the
Yeah.
cemetery perspective. I think it's kind of like Cow Point and Turner Farm are sort of the two sort of classic examples of it, one being a cemetery and one being a habitation site, right? Like sort of two sides to a coin in some ways.
Yeah. And
but
Turner Farms on Penn Bay in Maine, Penobscot Bay.
Yeah. And so Cow Point is near Grand Lake in sort of south central New Brunswick, along the Volostog. Interesting too that the site was identified by some local collectors, avocational archaeologists. I think they brought it to Sanger's attention, didn't they? Like there's kind of an interesting story where he got called away from work at Minister's Island, didn't he? He was doing other excavation work, and he was on. So at this time, the Canadian Museum was called the National Museum of Man, and had funding basically to had sort of realized that all sorts of development and things were happening all across Canada in the post Second World War setting that were threatening archaeological resources. And so the National Museum of Man fanned out like the 10 archaeologists that worked in the country to essentially document the archaeology, the rapidly threatened archaeological record across Canada. And so Sanger was in the province at the time doing some work and the coast in around Passamaquoddy Bay area at Minister's Island, and the site was brought to his attention and sort of arrived there and immediately realized how important it was.
My interest in this was because I was interested in Minister's Island. I think you were at one point too, Ken. And I transcribed David Sanger's journals from that period, and David Sanger's kind of a legendarily I think detailed note taker actually, and so I was surprised by the terseness of some of the entries. One of my favorites being just that the day's entry was boat accident in AM, and a feeling we perhaps all had. And then it became apparent though as I was reading these that this was because Sanger was substantially involved in actually setting up his work at Cow Point, which was threatened, I think, essentially the fear that it was going to be looted out. Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And there's kind of famous pictures of like they had some sort of crude fencing that they had put around it. Like there's a sign up, I think, in one of the pictures that you could see that that they're trying to keep no trespassing and that kind of thing. And they were excavating quickly because they were concerned that essentially like this. I think he mentions in the monograph like they were coming back and like in the morning you could see that there had been people at the site basically.
Yeah, that's my recollection as well of the monograph. And the monograph will be in the show notes too. So. Which is worth looking at. So Cow Point's on this small lake, drains into Grand Lake. It's 85 kilometers inland, still probably some tidal effects. And it's got 59 or more burial features. It has some teeth that were recovered, but primarily it's small ochre stained pits, which is just flexed, so kind of curled up rather than extended burials. And it's got more than 300 artifacts, which really fit with this. Very much these artifacts would not be out of place with the Port au Choix cemetery we described. Yeah. Shark teeth, plummets, gouges, celts, constructing stem points. And then the bayonets are slightly different. They're these long bayonets with on one side these kind of hexagonal patterns on them. And so when we're describing these bayonets, what we're talking about are slate bayonets, which I am realizing as I'm saying the phrase slate bayonet that I've been interested in archaeology long enough. This means nothing to the listener, and Ken knows exactly what I'm describing.
Yeah. So a bayonet, think about the spiky knife thing that comes off the end of one of those like old timey guns, basically, right? And slate, like so most people know. When they think of slate, they think of like a kind of a tingy rock that that you back in the like 1930s or 40s, you might have slate pencils for writing on chalkboards or that sort of thing, or you might have like a really nice cheese board made out of slate now. But basically, it's a softer rock that kind of grayish in color, and so these are. Probably like 15 or so centimeters long, like 15 to 30 centimeters long. Like they're fairly elaborate. Like actually, they might be longer than that. Like I'm trying to think. Like yeah, probably at least 30 centimeters. Some of these,
Yeah.
and they're very narrow. Like they'd be 3 to 4 centimeters wide at most, and probably like maybe 1 to 2 centimeters thick. So these are really fine, um, very pointed, and then they have these geometric designs on the surfaces of them, alongside these indentations on the sides that Gabe had mentioned, and they're different than the ones from Port au Choix in a way that we think that they represent something.
That's right. So the ones at Port au Choix tend to be look a little bit more like actually kind of like a trowel, or like and by that I mean like a mason's trowel, or like something you'd use to like a slice of pie. They're a little bit bigger at the bottom. Whereas the ones at Turner Farm may represent, or they certainly seem to resemble the sword on a swordfish. So
Cow Point.
Think about it.
And at Turner Farm, I guess. At Cow
Yeah,
Point, they look like yes.
Sorry, yeah, Cow Point they look at Cow Point they look like bayonets. Sorry, yeah. They and these may resemble swordfish. You're that I'm telling you, Ken, trying to think through. Do you know that diagram we talked about last fortnight, where it was Robinson had the burial components and then the
question marks and the dots
and the question marks? Sometimes it's like describing the stuff, and you're sort of like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna jump through this. I was thinking about this the other day with these. It's like they're all sort of like David Black stratigraphy diagrams, right? Where he's using the kind of diagrams that historical archaeologists use, and he makes very clear that even though he knows full well one stratum relates to another, he can't say that with scientific certainty. So he puts this big they can't connect, and but anyway, that's how I felt like just right there.
We've already gone into placemaking like at before explaining anything else. So like we've got people hanging on by just their fingertips right now. So
yeah, exactly. The folks in the archaeology lab at St. Mary's University just opened the fridge for another beer. I think that's what we heard. And but okay, so to return to this idea, we've got these bayonets, and now let's. We unfortunately do not have someone who can kind of. We do have original music for this program, but it doesn't make the kind of Doctor Who soundtrack that scans over to us talking about a habitation site. And so what we're going to do is we're going to imagine now.
I could add a swoosh.
You can add a swoosh. That's great. Does that mean Nike sponsors us if we do that? I mean, all of a sudden we're like the University of Oregon. And the Turner Farm, which is an island in Penobscot Bay, and it's an example of one of these late maritime archaic habitation sites. So swoosh sound inserted, and the thing that the listener should be really interested in about this site is that the listener can't see, but Ken is rapidly changing plugs on his earphones, which makes me think he can't hear me. Can you hear me now, Ken? Oh, I cannot hear Ken though now.
And we're back. We've got some refreshments and a charger, and I think we are in Penobscot Bay.
We are indeed. And so we were talking about the Turner Farm site because it's an example of, as Ken and I were just talking about, this difficulty connecting in the archaic, these habitation sites and cemetery sites. And Penobscot Bay is an example of a habitation site worked on by Bruce Bork. And also, but for what we're going to talk about right now, there's the zoo archaeology was done by Art Spies and Lewis, who's
Hedden, right?
No,
Spies and Lewis. Yeah, Spies and Lewis. That's right.
Spies and Lewis. Robert Lewis, right?
Yeah. Just a second. It's on my shelf here.
Okay, yeah. So Ken is going to check his shelf, and but the reason this is particularly relevant here is that
Robert A. Lewis.
It is Robert A. Lewis. Great,
beautiful book, actually.
It is, and it's just a fantastic zooarch analysis, actually, of this site.
It becomes a comprehensive, like, regional analysis in the end.
That's right. Yeah, it does. And there's also some like really interesting stuff in there that we'll talk about when we talk about the woodland. But like, a sort of thoughtful consideration of whether or not Wabanaki people were hunting whales.
Yeah.
Just really good book. It's available from the Maine Arch Society, and you should acquire it. I think it's extremely inexpensive.
It's like all things that the Maine Arch Society produces, it's shockingly inexpensive.
Yeah. So we should just, I mean, they're not sponsoring us, but we should just do a shameless plug for the Maine Arch Society, which is that it's actually really worth joining, especially if you're a student.
Yeah, I think it's so I think even for me, it's still only about $15 a year American for full membership. I can't remember. It might be a little bit more than that now, but you get a peer-reviewed, or well, a journal that's has some peer-reviewed articles, some not. You get a newsletter that comes out every couple of months, and you get a discount on stuff in the store too, if I remember correctly.
You do, yeah.
And the publications that the Maine Arch Society has released are really high quality archaeology publications. Several monographs on really important sites in Maine. And I think the most recent one is the monograph on the Goddard site by Steve Cox.
That's right. Yeah. So that's foreshadowing, I would say.
Yeah,
is what we've
exactly.
just done there. Yeah. But you may recall now that, listener, even 30 minutes later, now that we were talking about how these bayonets at Cow Point resemble swordfish swords or swordfish rostra. It's a word for your next cocktail party. Is that at Turner Farm and at other of these late maritime archaic habitation sites, there is a fair bit of swordfish. There are rostra, there are other swordfish remains. And so, Ken, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but one of the other big late maritime archaic sites in Maine is a site called the Nevin site from central Maine.
Yep.
And
it's pretty close to Goddard, isn't it?
Not far off, yeah. So Blue Hill Bay, I guess. And my undergraduate advisor was Brian Robinson, who was an expert on the Moorhead phase. I mean, he's expert on a lot of things, but worked a lot on the Moorhead phase, wrote his dissertation on the Moorhead phase. And I was in his lab class, and he had sent a graduate student out for basically a bucket of Moorhead's backfill from the Nevin site that we were processing in this lab class. And so I'm processing it through graded geological sieves, and I shake it, and most of the stuff in it I kind of recognize, but there's this one piece of bone. I have no idea what it is. It looked totally unique, totally unlike anything I was familiar with at that juncture. And it was a piece of swordfish bone from the Nevin site.
Oh, cool.
Which is, really cool. And something like that will stick with you, right? Like it's a real kind of evocative moment. And anyway, so this connection to swordfish appears to be a real thing for people in the late maritime archaic. And swordfish are an interesting species. And I'm going to go ahead and disclose here that I don't entirely know what to make of swordfish. There's the classic kind of old man in the sea understanding of swordfish, right? Which is the listener will recognize from that reference just how highly literary I am. And but it's a guy, you hunt swordfish, and they're big and they're difficult to hunt, and they're these large,
like quick moving, probably aggressive,
and they're prone to maybe come up through the bottom of your canoe. So we assume these people are hunting in dugout canoes,
which are tippy.
Indeed. And so you've got this connection to this really big kind of important fish that we've now seen both in the zooarchaeological record of what people are eating and in the ritual record of what people are including in their cemeteries.
Yeah, and there's a really fantastic paper from Matt Betts, David Black, and Susan Blair that talks about maybe a little bit why. So we know that the late maritime archaic groups are really fixated on fishing and fisheries. A lot of the tools that you find in these graves are probably could be construed as fishing implements. So you've got plummets that are probably could be construed as net sinkers of some kind, so indicating that kind of fishery. You've got harpoons and that sort of thing. But Matt and David and Sue have a paper where they talk about how the inclusion of shark teeth in these late maritime archaic burials and these moorhead burials may be an indication of the sort of a ritual importance of sharks being a predator for swordfish, and that the people who were hunting the swordfish who were buried in these sites may have been embodying that shark when they were out on that hunt. And so they are becoming the predator-prey relationship between the human hunting the swordfish and the shark hunting the swordfish. The human becomes that shark or embodies that shark to be able to make that hunt, to have that successful hunt.
And there's substantial literature out there that suggests that this is the kind of relationship that hunter-gatherers tend to have with animals, right?
Yeah. Including contemporary Inuit hunters and or like in ethnographic Inuit and Wabanaki groups, and that's sort of embodying the prey, the predator species and the prey species, and the what is the is it the Tanner line that the animal gives themselves up to the hunter?
Yeah, so there's this great book, the Bringing Home Animals by Adrian Tanner, where essentially Ken and I are not doing well at keeping this under. There's no pitch clock. The listener who's been following my concern about the destruction of Major League Baseball will be aware that there's no pitch clock on this program. And but yeah, and Tanner wrote this book, Bring Home Animals, basically about the relationship between hunters and their prey being different, right? That there's these sort of animal masters who, because you've behaved correctly, will give up the animals to you, essentially. And so this tends to be particularly true for kind of prominent dangerous species like swordfish, right?
Yeah.
And we certainly see lots of evidence for the importance of swordfish, probably including their being represented on these rostra, their rostra being represented on these bayonets. In addition to evidence for the open water of capturing for swordfish, we see evidence at Turner Farm for a huge amount of fishing for cod. Bruce Borks actually argued that they were fishing so much cod that they fished down the food web enough that there was actually a kind of local effect that the cod stocks were locally diminished.
Crazy.
Yeah, remarkable. I'm not a zooarchaeologist enough to evaluate that claim, but based on isotopic evidence, it seems believable. They're also eating moose and caribou, waterfowl and great auk. We also see during this period that clams are incredibly important. And so Art Spies has done a few papers now, actually, on pointing out just how important shellfish are to the diet for pre-contact people. And they're not eating much seal. So one thing the listener may be sort of thinking about here is that, okay, well, this sort of sounds like a scary way to go out and make your living hunting these swordfish, right? They call them swordfish, because they've got this thing, right? And they like to burst up to the bottom of your canoe and screw you up. But they're also they're huge, right? I mean, so they're, in the Hemingway novella, it's late in the evening, we can call it a novella. He's hunting alone while listening to, or wishing he had a radio, I think, to listen to the Yankees games. But it makes a lot more sense to hunt these things as part of a team. And so we're kind of returning to that idea about complexity, right? There's ideas that, well, when you're capturing animals of this size, right? We've certainly got examples of like, the Kungsan or other, groups will hunt large animals and have a very egalitarian ethos towards it. We'll go out and hunt them together. But more often we might be thinking about the kinds of political organization where we're thinking about something much closer to being kind of a whaling society, right? Where we've got people who own ships, right? And who go out and have to deal with landing large fish and this kind of thing. And so does this imply a certain amount along with the burials of social complexities? There's been talk about boat captains and this sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's not just the fishing. Like, so Loring has made a similar argument that this may be the reason why you see, for example, Ramachurt, which is this particular type of stone that we've talked about, I think, earlier in the show, that makes it all its way from the northern tip of Labrador down into parts of the Maritimes and New England during the late Archaic or Maritime Archaic. And I think he attributes that to this notion of boat captains maybe moving things around. These, there are these what we sometimes call big men, I guess. Would I be stretching it too far by saying that?
Well, big men is also what they've been calling Ken and I since about year one of the pandemic. But no, I think that's exactly right. And so I could tell Ken. So Ken and I both, I work at UNB. Ken did his first 2 degrees at UNB. I did my second degree at UNB. And we actually are unable to say the phrase "big man" without thinking of the VHS tape of Ongka's Big Moka, which is about that phenomenon, I think. But what do you mean when you say big man, Ken?
So basically, these are we sometimes call them social aggrandizers, and so these are prominent individuals in society who essentially have done something that they or have access to, maybe a particular resource. They're a particularly adept hunter, maybe, and so they kind of gain social capital. But they're also able to sort of mobilize labor to sort of perpetuate that social capital. So maybe you're a good hunter, people recognize that, and so they want to hunt with you. And then because of that, you actually get more from the hunt each time. And so you have within your group, you sort of build up this like actual, material capital. So you've actually got more food, and that ends up sort of perpetuating sort of the social and political capital within the group more generally. And so this big men, so these are the individuals within society that sort of, they accumulate wealth, both through their own actions, but also by motivating others to do things that assist them in this. And they kind of are able to keep people within that movement. As the good times roll, they can continue to aggrandize, but there are many different case examples of this sort of falling apart in different situations.
And if we were Salons and service, we'd say that would be kind of a tribe level of organization.
Level of organization, yeah. So that's probably 20 to 50 people, I think, is tribe. Is that sort of the window that they use?
That's still bandable, I think.
Is that still bandable? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're talking 50 to 200.
Yeah. The intro to anthropology student will know exactly what we're talking about, and everyone else will neither know nor care, and that's okay. But basically, it's this kind of idea. We're riffing on this idea that we're separating complexity from these fundamental economic concerns, right? Because Ongka's really worried about a pig, I think, in that movie, right?
I will fully admit I have no recollection of this movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Is this the Cooler Ring one?
No. Ongka's wearing a T-shirt that says, "Why don't we do it in the road?" Do you remember this?
I don't know if I ever saw this.
You must have. You went to UNB.
Well,
it was pumped through the vents in Annex C.
Well, there's
interesting.
I was pumping something else through the vents in my undergrad. So.
Yeah, so was I. So I was watching Ongka's Big Moka. Okay. Anyway, no, but so he's dealing with I think essentially a kind of pig roast, and then I apologize to the listener. My cat is coming, who wears a bell, so you may hear him. But no, Ongka or the people who deal with yams, so domesticates of other kinds.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so this sort of tribal level organization. But okay, now listener, Ken and I are going to try to tie this together in a way that made some sense. So we've talked about basically a really prominent and really archaeologically visible group from Newfoundland and one from Maine and the Maritimes, Maritime Peninsula. And we've talked about economic similarities that they all had. We've talked about similarities in their burial practices. And for each group, we've suggested that there may be implications of complexity. This concept that we introduced at the beginning of the show. We've also sort of talked about the ways in which these people fit into the sort of popular understanding of archaeology in this region. And so at the very, very beginning of this show, we talked about Jim Tuck and his sense that this was a big, broadly integrated culture, basically running from Maine all the way up to the northern tip of Newfoundland and Labrador. And so subsequent to that, though, that view that Tuck had was countered by Bruce Bork. And the listener can't see this, but I'm wearing a lapel pin because Bruce and I disagreed fairly vociferously about this question, which we're about to discuss. And we're going to put a link to Bruce's book, The Swordfish Hunters, in the show notes, because Bruce is a very thoughtful archaeologist, has a lot to say about some of this. And he and I are almost 98.5% at odds in how we view this. So I thought about, I Googled steelman arguments. How can I steelman Bruce's argument? What I should do is get on this show tonight. I'm going to really portray Bruce's argument in the strongest possible terms. I think the way to do that is actually that you should just read Bruce's book. Read Bruce's book and kind of compare it to my views on this. And I think, Ken, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I get the sense that your views on this are somewhat aligned with mine.
Yeah. I would. I'm not as intimately involved in this as you are, and you and Matt have a forthcoming publication on some of this stuff, and have written about it in your book recently. But it was actually Matt that kind of pointed out this, literally pointed to the similarities between Port au Choix and Cow Point when I visited the Canadian Museum, and this would have been I would have been an undergrad, I think, then. And Matt was kind enough to take me into the collections room and basically showed me all of this material from one spot, and they showed me all this material from the other. And he kind of said, you notice anything similar between them? And I was like, well, they look like almost, this is pretty similar stuff. I'm just looking at stone tools and a few other things here, and it looks very similar. Like you would kind of draw a connection even just at a cursory level, right? And so I would tend, and out of that, I, have grown to see these connections that I find it difficult to see how you couldn't see these connections in some way. So I'm going to let you take it from here, because you actually thought about this in some detail and quite recently.
And so you mentioned Matt, and I should actually say that almost all of my any insight I have about this is actually almost entirely derived from Matt being quite thoughtful about this. And so I'm riffing heavily on Matt's work here. And I should just sort of say, I think that lots of these people, I think including Bruce, recognize that there's all sorts of similarities, ostensibly between these various kinds of groups. And by various kinds of groups, I mean various regional groups. And my cat is just totally barrelhouse through here, so I apologize for the noise and my distraction. But if you're Bruce Bork, I think the argument essentially is that the groups in Maine and the Maritimes are different because there's this huge spatial difference that seemingly when Bruce Bork was working in places like Turner Farm, there's a big hole in the record, right? There didn't seem like there was much late maritime archaic stuff from Nova Scotia, for instance. He also sort of, I think, quite correctly sort of said, well, there's some real subsistence differences between the Newfoundland folks and the Maine folks, right? In Newfoundland, we see that people are hunting sea mammals. Virtually there's hardly any seal remains from Turner Farm. There's some,
but there's a lot at Port au Choix.
There's a ton at Port au Choix, right? In part because that location is perfect for you to just camp there and just club seals while they hop out. Yeah, exactly. Where you get caribou and swordfish and deer and moose and sailfish at places like Turner Farm. And then also that essentially in Newfoundland, you've got basically a subarctic environment, and at Penn Bay, you've got a pretty temperate climate. And so what Matt and I put in the chapter, and really what Matt put in the chapter, I'll take credit only for the one typo I discovered today while reading this, which was that we screwed up the radiocarbon dates at Turner Farm by 1,000 years, because there's a big difference between a 5 and a 6 if they're in the wrong spot. And was that really a large area of occupation for indigenous culture is not actually that unusual. And in some of our private collections work, examining private collections in Nova Scotia, we've identified a fair bit of really clearly late maritime archaic material. One of my personal favorites is we were doing basically we do these kind of collector events where collectors come and show their collections, and we used to record information about them. And one came in as a whole coffee table. I assume you've had experiences like this, Ken, where it's a coffee table and the top has been plexiglass.
Yeah,
and
sort of sealed in there.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's but it had some definitely maritime archaic material in it.
Yeah.
But also there's been these drawdowns on the Mersey River, places like that, and there's been maritime archaic material from those settings as well. And then in Matt, zooarchaeologist, so he thinks about animal remains, hunting animals a lot, and he's kind of pointed out that whether you're hunting pinnipeds, which is a very fancy word for seals, or you're hunting big fish, you're using canoes, harpoons, lances. These are really similar kinds of technologies, right? So it's sure the animal changes as it would because the environment has changed.
Yeah.
But this is still a similar kind of life way, right? It's a similar way of thinking about the world. And we know that there are cosmological similarities. We see inclusions of shark teeth. We see different attitudes towards animals, but still with these inclusions in these kinds of cemeteries. And then finally, yeah, the climate is different, but the forest conditions during the late Maritime Archaic are actually pretty similar between the northern end and so that is, northern Newfoundland and southern end, so let's say Penn Bay. And the faunal diversity is actually pretty identical. So there's no real reason to think that we wouldn't have similar abilities of these sorts of groups to flourish. And, in fact, in places like Labrador, as Chris Wolf has published in our hit piece from last week, we get these, really profound evidence for complexity, despite these kind of less lovely climates than we enjoy in such balmy places as New Brunswick.
What we sort of traditionally call like marginal climates, right?
Yeah,
like difficult places to live.
Yeah, today I don't know. I don't really want to be in like Labrador today.
It's I mean, your field season's over pretty early.
Yeah, I guess it is. I mean, but that's just because you've wrecked your helicopter and you've had to crawl out of the burning wreckage, isn't it?
I've never seen something in North America quite like a timberfly.
What is a timberfly?
It's basically like it's like a mosquito that's got a stinger that's about as long as your pinky, and they're about the size of a deer fly.
Oh no!
But they're really long bodies and these giant stingers on them. And
so do you swell up?
I think you're essentially like you're down, like your limb is harmed. There was an Innu fellow on the crew who had I don't know if it was like one of the zapper rackets, but I remember like looking more like a almost like a racquetball racket, and that was what he was like. He had prepared to like swat away timberflies.
That's horrifying.
The first time I saw one, I was like, this is what you would expect to see in like the jungle, not in Goose Bay.
And the listeners know Ken has worked in the jungle.
I have.
Yeah.
And I saw tarantulas, but I didn't see timberflies.
Which one's scarier?
I don't know. I think the timberfly really.
Yeah, there's something about being able to fly that just isn't great. So the listener that will detect, and I'm wearing a pin that says Woke Vanguard because I've got this somewhat controversial view of this, but that I have a sense that there's just this big kind of continuity across this area, and that's interesting because it sets a substrate for our discussion about continuity that's really going to persist over the next several episodes of this podcast, where we're going to, I think, probably emphasize more similarity than dissimilarity through time.
Yep. And
take, even when we discuss next week, which will be our I think next week will be our most serious test of discontinuity, where we may actually discuss population movement in a serious way.
Yep.
But that we are basically going to sort of argue that regionally there's at this period there's this big shared cultural substrate going from Penn Bay, or probably really Seabrook Marsh, probably if you were to extend it to some of Brian Robinson's work down here, all the way up into Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're willing to accept that that's not a universally held opinion, but it's the one that we have. And we think there's some good evidence for it, basically the part we've just outlined, and we'll make that case again in 2 weeks or so.
Yeah. And to sort of tie it back to this notion of making place, Cow Point's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So the location of the site is actually sort of along the present day lakeshore. And the time that this site would have been occupied was essentially sort of at the end of what had been a fairly dramatic environmental change, process of environmental change in that particular region of the lower Wolastoq. And so we don't actually see stabilization in sort of the river as we know it today, really until about the time just before or just after Cow Point would have been, sometime right around when Cow Point would have been occupied or shortly thereafter. The present day shorelines of the Wolastoq would have been established. You had sort of an increasingly open environment there, like the water is sort of getting lower and lower in that region to stabilize to about where it settled out. And it is interesting to think about how we have a really strong, basically from the time Cow Point is occupied onwards, we have a very detectable and archaeologically rich record in that region in around the Grand Lake Meadows from sort of that time onwards. And you think about sort of settling into a place and making place in a certain region, and certainly an overt act like having this sort of cemetery of this regionalized movement. You can imagine that probably this place would have been known even by people who were not related to those who were buried there. And that's a really overt expression of a connection to a place and a way to know that place too, to kind of sort of exemplify how these significant acts by individuals and by small groups can actually perpetuate this notion of a connection of particular places in the landscape.
And I think that's a great transition to, as our Courvoisier gets a little lower in the bottle here, to just a little bit of foreshadowing about next fortnight. Or sorry, it's probably actually 2 fortnights from now, because we're going to do our SAI special.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so in 4 weeks, because in 2 weeks we're going to have Ken live from Portland, the other Portland.
The West Coast Portland.
The West Coast Portland. It's just why the Late Maritime Archaic end. And some of this is that there's, again, this is, and I'm essentially just owe much of this thing to Matt, which I find really convincing. We've got climate change, where we've got this sea level rise, and there's all sorts of implications when sea levels rise for coastal productivity. It's hard to really, so I was about to say it's hard to really model. It's probably actually pretty easy to model, but it's pretty hard for archaeologists to describe what exactly happens when sea level rises. I feel like I was at this conference once and archaeologists explaining, he's just really riffing on how difficult things are to model. And then he got into, in their tides, they're totally unpredictable. And one of the geologists he said, no, tides are totally predictable. He's like, oh yeah, right.
Humans are unpredictable.
It's the humans that are a problem. But temperatures were also getting colder. They were pretty warm at the start of the Late Maritime Archaic. That also may have some implications for swordfish, how swordfish act when water temperatures change. The tree line was further north. There was less sea ice, more precipitation. And then actually, right at the end of the Late Maritime Archaic in New Brunswick, we had these white pine hemlock dominated forests that start to shift to being a bit birch dominated by about 3800 BP or so, calibrated BP. And then also there are at both ends of the Maritime Archaic, this is the big foreshadowing part. I know the listener already was probably a climate scientist. We're very popular in the climate science community, but had some sense of there are some other people, other cultural groups that may be doing things. So in the South, this includes the potential arrival of Susquehanna people about 3,800 years ago. and in the north, pre-Dorset, so Inuit people, around 4,100 years ago, potentially. So we've got potentially both climate pressures and human pressures going on that are going to result in some of the cultural changes that we're going to talk to you about in like 28 days, which is deep in the future.
And we may not get back to it, but we're talking about pre-Dorset right around this time. But we would actually, if we touch on it at all, we're talking about particular places. The Dorset actually essentially live in the same landscape as Port au Choix, about 3,000 years later, at a site that we call Phillips Garden.
That's right. And so the listener would check out MAP Renouf, I think.
Yep.
For that.
Her and Trevor
Bell?
Trevor Bell, is it?
Yeah, I think it's Bell, yeah.
Yeah.
And Bell also done good climate work on that side, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's how they figured out like where the houses were. They did some interesting sea level change modeling, basically, or shoreline modeling, and figured out like, well, there's a cemetery here. There's got to be houses somewhere.
Yeah. They I don't know if you were at the you were definitely at the Papers in Honor of David Sanger at CAA maybe 10 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
And Bell was giving I think that paper, but had the book they just published that in, and he got to the thing in the paper, and he's reading it, and it says handbook to David. and it's David Sanger, the book they published. This is a fun business, is it not, Ken?
It is.
There's a lot worse ways to make a living.
There certainly are.
Yeah. So, as our Courvoisier dwindles, shall we turn to hit pieces?
I think we're on to we're on to our hit piece tonight.
It's a hit piece. That's right. Yeah. So our hit piece tonight is the journalistic enterprise ProPublica, which is a kind of wide-ranging, I think, investigative journalism thing. So they do stuff on medicine, they do stuff on nonprofits, they do all sorts of things that are investigative. But the one that we're going to tell you about is that they've just, in this new year, launched one about repatriation, focused in the United States. And we think this is a kind of an appropriate one to bring up this week because Ken and I are both uncomfortable talking about burials, talking about sites that have human remains of Indigenous people. And that's because we are fully aware that our discipline has been implicit in, just really sort of no way to sugarcoat it, horrific ways of approaching the treatment of Indigenous people and particularly of Indigenous human remains. And so the ProPublica Repatriation Project reporting program, which we will link in the show notes, is focusing in on a series of journalistic stories about repatriation in the United States. The listener may have encountered one which has received some airplay in the United States, and I think in Canada as well, about UC Berkeley. It has an enormous number of human remains, Indigenous human remains in their teaching collections.
Close to 10,000 people.
It was, yeah, close to 10,000 ancestors is my understanding. And the story, if the listener Googles like UC Berkeley, Tim White teaching collection, this will come up, that story. Or you can go to the ProPublica website, which we'll link. Deals with this problem that institutions have, which is that they have human remains, and many American institutions are pretty old, right? And so they've accumulated from before NAGPRA, which have we discussed NAGPRA, Ken? On this,
we covered it cursorily in the first week, but the Native American Graves and Repatriation, what's the
Protection and Repatriation Act? Yeah.
Protection and Repatriation Act, yeah. We talked about it briefly, but this was passed in 1990 after many years of court battles, that which was basically a federal
It's a rare
mandate.
case where you see George Bush with a pen and you don't feel nervous.
Yeah. It was basically a federal mandate, and it was tied to the National Historic Preservation Act in a way, but essentially it was a mandate from any federally funded institution or an institution that receives federal funding. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So
was
public
required,
monies. Yeah.
was basically required by law to repatriate human remains and burial goods. There's a term for there's an NAGPRA term for burial
Funerary
goods.
objects.
Funerary objects. Yeah. But it had to be to the closest descendant community who could trace lineal descent with the remains that were in collections, which has created all sorts of political and practical issues for descendant communities because of competing territorial claims, the lack of recognition of some tribal entities in the United States, and certainly we were lucky to have learned about a really important case from Maine in Massachusetts, the Peabody Institute. But
it's funny.
yeah.
I was actually, as soon as you said, I was thinking that just when we should get Marla on a podcast to talk about this.
Yeah, I think
Marla
she could
Taylor
probably be quite a bit more evocative about this than I can.
Yeah.
But without question, I mean, NAGPRA was passed in I think it was 1990, and here we are, 30 some odd years out, and there's still, tens of, like, well over 10,000 ancestral remains stored on shelves in museums and at universities and institutions in the United States, probably caught in some kind of legal battle over who has control over these things.
Yeah, it's a little unclear from the but there. So I think my understanding is one of the conflicts is just determining the way in which this is determined. It can be a variety of things, and whether it's a kind of, when we think of descent, we have to think of genetic kind of understanding of descent, where you can have a more cultural understanding of descent, which is under NAGPRA should count.
Yeah.
But really, as I'm talking here, I'm realizing we should just get Marla Taylor at the Robert S. Peabody on for a podcast, probably.
Yeah,
and
probably
have her actually explain this to you.
And I think it'd be important too to maybe have somebody put this in a Canadian context as well, because
Absolutely.
we don't have federal legislation. We also don't have federal repatriation legislation, and without question, there have been mandates to repatriate funerary goods and human remains. But I don't know. I guess I don't know how successful Canadians have been. I think for the most part, I don't know if many institutions would have human remains left at them. But and I know that museums have even made a very concerted effort at repatriating even funerary goods over the last few years. But maybe we could tap into somebody at, like, the National Museum, the Museum of History, that could maybe give us an insight on that.
Yeah, I think that would be good, because I mean it's particularly relevant, I think, for the kind of discussion we had this week, where we're trying to think about traditions that are really defined in large part by historic work on mortuary material, right? And so trying to think about how this all connects to how we understand the past, but also I think one of the points that I've tried to make this week, and that we hope the listener takes away from this discussion, is that the understanding that we at least have taken from the archaeological record is one of a sort of Wabanaki past, which is very different than the narrative, I think, that many people might have of Indigenous people in the Northeast, right?
Yeah, one that has a fairly traceable cultural descendancy and continuity, as it relates to not just technology and practice, but also place and those sorts of connections.
Yeah, and to a fairly vast place too, which I think is important. Yeah. So I think it's possible that with this hit piece, I'm suggesting people check out the ProPublica repatriation page. We've actually done a lot of foreshadowing, and we've hopefully solicited various people to come on to talk about this. We hope that they are among our adored listeners, as all of you listeners are too. And Ken, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap this up?
No, as always, I want to thank everybody for listening. We haven't hit the 1,000 mark, so we don't have that exclusive 1,000th listener prize is still up for grabs. But we really appreciate it. We appreciate the 5 stars, and if you're listening and you want to follow and add another 5-star, that's it's really great. Our sponsor is thrilled about it, and at some point, we may even get a dinner out of this thing. So
yeah, no, it's true. The listener may not know this, but every 5-star review we get, we immediately text each other simultaneously. But because Ken and I text each other simultaneously with a 3-hour time difference, it actually sometimes wakes one of us up. And since Ken has children, it can be a little disruptive, but that's okay. We appreciate every one of them just as much as we appreciated the very first. And actually, in all seriousness, Ken and I are having an awful lot of fun doing this. So thanks very much. And we enjoy talking to you every fortnight. Next one will be, we say live, but it'll actually perhaps be even a little delayed because Ken edits these. I write the show notes. Ken does the editing. Ken may be flying back from the SAA, so it may be a little slower next fortnight than it has been traditionally. But we are really looking forward to having a live show where Ken will be there in Portland, Oregon,
and handing out our swag. So come find me, listener. If you are attending the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting in Portland, Oregon, track me down because I will have stickers in my jacket at all times.
Should we give them should there be a phrase? Should we have a catchphrase?
Oh, I don't know. Do we have a slogan?
No, we don't. We don't have a slogan, but they could just come up and they could say something like, what would they say?
I don't know.
I feel like we could make
where did chicken nuggets originate?
Chicken tendies.
Chicken tenders, right? Chicken
tenders. Yeah. Sorry, you're thinking about the so actually that was supposed to be in Hakuna Errata. Apparently I misstated the flavors of the tendies, but so yeah, if you see Ken at the SAAs, walk up to him and say chicken tendies. And you're gonna get a sticker.
Yeah, you're gonna get a sticker.
Yeah,
and we'll know you listened. That's
we will.
Yeah.
We're looking at you, St. Mary's University Archaeology Lab and Vermont Archaeologists.
And if you missed the opportunity in Portland, we'll have some swag at the Canadian Archaeological Association meeting in Member 2 at the start of May.
That's right, and we love to meet listeners, even though we've never met one yet.
Outside of our families and friends who we keep sending the podcast to.
Yes. And who we continue to adore.
Yeah, exactly.
Ken, I feel like we've gotten to this point where it's like that moment where we're leaving a restaurant and we know that our car is parked by someone else's car, but we've done the hugs.
Yeah.
So now we don't really know what to do. Do we walk around the block? How do we end this? Do we just say that we're looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier?
I think right now the music's playing, actually.
Fantastic. Well, Ken, this has been fun as always.
Yeah. Have a good evening, listener. And you too, Gabe.
Sorry, I thought you were going to wish me a good evening. I was going to say you too, and then I felt weird. But I also wish the listener a good evening.